localization occurs through a rebate mechanism as opposed to direct subsidy support. Only about 2 billion of the actual incentives for the industry are cash-based. The rest are all rebate-based. So it's a sector that contributes substantially to the economy, large amounts of sunk capital, positive impact on our trade balance at the moment, has been for a few years now. Some serious headwinds limiting its growth potential. So it's been stuck pretty much where it's at for about 10 years now in terms of its employment, in terms of its contribution to GDP. But still a formidable base and by far the most advanced base on the African continent. There'll be talk about Morocco because Morocco is producing similar numbers of vehicles to us, slightly less, but not far off anymore. But they're making a much, much cheaper set of vehicles than what we are. So if you look at GVA, gross value added, we are still more than double the size of the Moroccan automotive industry. So we're still the largest automotive manufacturing industry on the continent by some margin.
Thanks, Justin. And I suppose, I mean, that's really setting the scene between obviously South Africa and Morocco. So there's a reasonably sized manufacturing base, in Africa. I mean, Paul, I mean, that's obviously, I suppose, looking at the past. I mean, how do you see the future in terms of like a 5-year forecast for manufacturing? And I mean, what do you think the opportunities are for localization in the auto value chain?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Dwayne. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we have to look a little bit in the past, Dwayne, and we have to start, I suppose, with the auto industry master plan, which really had 2015 as its base, with about 600,000 vehicles produced in South Africa. And that had quite a nice growth trajectory of around 760,000 in 2020, 900,000 in 2025, and over 1.1 million in 2030. So very nice trajectory. The reality, however, is that, as Justin said, is that although there were close to 600,000 vehicles in 2015, 2019 was a peak year of around 615,000 vehicles. So not the trajectory that was expected. And then there was COVID. And then following COVID were the floods in KZN. So the industry went down to around 420,000 vehicles in 2020. So a significant decrease. And it's really struggled, I suppose, to grow after that. So 500,000 in 2021. And last year was the highest since 2019 of around 650,000 vehicles. If you look at for this year and you read NAMS's comparative analysis month on month through to June, you will see that on a comparative basis, we are down again in 2024. So if you extrapolate that forward, probably around 610,000 vehicles this year. So 5 years is very difficult to determine, and with the challenges that all the OEMs are going through, the challenges in the economies around the world. But, as Justin said, the auto component industry is significant behind this. So every, I talk on behalf of Mete, but I'm sure I talk on behalf of all of them. Looking for those localization opportunities, even though the base of vehicles is not what we thought, what are the further localization opportunities we can look at? New players coming into the South African market, Stellantis being one. What are the opportunities for us as localization? And, Beth will talk to it, but Narcan plays a fundamental job in helping us identify those opportunities. So not a great year. Last year was better than the year before, but 2019 was already 615,000 vehicles, and maybe we'll be at that for this year. But it's really solidifying each of the companies, making sure their tactics and their strategies are there, and kind of riding through the storm. I see that over the next few years, Dwayne.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, Beth, that probably leads us into, the auto industry around the world gets lots of support, right? There obviously is an argument saying it's heard the word like a special class industry, because it crowds in other investments in other industries as well. And if you can make cars, you can maybe make anything. What do you think the key policy and infrastructure initiatives are needed for South Africa to make sure that we stabilize the industry and grow it? How do you see that from a Narcan perspective?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Dwayne. I think Justin and Paul have set a really good kind of picture or scene for this particular question. So I think Justin's clearly highlighted the importance of the sector and the fact that it does punch above its weight. And Paul has really touched on what I think is Narcan our priority is, which is localization. Where we sit, I think, and Justin made mention of the support that the sector already garners. As a Narcan position, we want stability there, and I think that's important from an investor confidence perspective. We have a good APDP program. It is supportive of the sector. That needs to remain in place and remain stable, purely to, as I say, encourage continuous investment into the sector. That being said, I think localization really is the one area where if we were to go into tweaks with APDP from a policy perspective, localization is probably the area that needs to be considered. We are falling behind the master plan targets quite significantly. I think about 39.5% local content in 2023 versus what we should have been on the trajectory perspective of about 46%. So where we're sitting, we think there needs to be a degree of tweaking within the policies to further incentivize and encourage localization. And that really will help the sector grow. It creates more value add from a component perspective. And with that, obviously, more jobs and more skilled jobs at that. So that's really it on the policy side and where our kind of key focus sits. On an infrastructure perspective, obviously to localize, we need to be as globally competitive as possible. We already do have world-class manufacturers within the sector, but certainly more competitiveness enhancing reforms. So if we're talking about port efficiency, obviously stopping load shedding, those type of infrastructure reforms would certainly help really promote South Africa as an investment destination of choice and encourage the growth in production and localization. And then beyond the kind of more obvious infrastructure reforms and obviously localization as a policy intervention, we also need to consider, well, where do opportunities lie? From where we sit, I think you mentioned at the start the African market and how that's growing quite rapidly. We see export growth as a really key strategy to somewhat de-risk the South African industry from a low growth environment that South Africa as a country is in, and really capitalize on opportunities. And I think if we're talking purely Africa, look, there's export opportunities outside of just Africa. But if we're talking Africa, where our focus as Narcan is sitting is the moment seeing how we can develop particularly the aftermarket side of exports into the continent. I think that's where the opportunity currently sits. But equally looking longer term to develop a wider kind of export basket, not just into Africa, but the wider kind of trading ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And I suppose that leads us back to you, Justin, around there's lots of talk about new energy vehicles, electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and how that's creating potential risk. Okay, currently most manufacturers in South Africa have got a whole, I suppose, value chain that's supporting internal combustion engines. So I think the question really is, and then also we're starting to see nervousness globally, let's maybe put it that way, where I think countries are sort of saying, okay, well, we initially had a target to ban ICE vehicles in 2030, and now they're, maybe it's 2035, and and it's starting to get legislated. But there seems to be lots of nervousness around from governments, okay, and maybe that might even change with the results of some of the elections that are happening around the world. What's your view in terms of the, I suppose, the NEVs? Is it really slowing? Okay, and how do you think that go back to the discussion we're having with Beth around localization? Does it create an opportunity for us to localize, or is it putting some challenges and headwinds for our local component and manufacturing industry? Maybe some of your insights on that.
Yeah, it's a broad question. I want to try and locate the question in regards to the local market. So the challenge that we have, and Beth outlined the strength of our policy framework, and the industry is obviously supported through the APDP and the umbrella sort of strategy is the South African Automotive Master Plan. The challenge is that our automotive policy is actually schizophrenic. Everybody talks about the support the automotive industry gets, but the industry is actually excessively taxed in the market. So although we have a very supportive production incentive, we actually have a very poorly constituted market. This is a market that is excessively taxed. The ad valorem tax structure has not been adjusted since 1995. Essentially, even the cheapest motor cars in South Africa are now subjected to quite severe luxury taxes, which were never meant for entry-level motor cars. Those taxes were set in the mid-1990s for luxury cars, and they've never been, the level was never changed. So now you buy a family motor car in South Africa, you're already getting a 30% luxury tax. On top of that, the environmental levy and the tire levy, etc. So we have a very, very highly taxed market, and the elasticity calculations we've done show how much damage that is doing to consumption in the market. So the challenge that we have in South Africa in relation to these new energy vehicles is amplified by our market structure and the way in which our market is taxed by National Treasury. So battery electric vehicles and any derivative of that. So if we talk about a hybrid, a soft hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, and then a battery electric, these vehicles are more expensive than the internal combustion equivalents. The technology has not yet reached parity with the internal combustion engine, and it's still a few years off. It's getting close, but the gap's quite wide. When we did the calculations a couple of years ago, when we did direct model comparisons without subsidies, so without taking into account incentives, it was around about 50% more expensive on average, a battery electric over its ICE equivalent. Now, because we have a punitive tax structure where there's a gradient to the luxury tax in South Africa, any increase in price creates a higher tax burden. So in South Africa, a battery electric equivalent of an ICE is not going to be 50% more expensive. It's going to be 80% more expensive because of how this luxury tax gradient works in the country. So we're in a difficult position because of the schizophrenic policy. The government makes well over 80,000 Rand a vehicle in terms of the amount of taxes it takes from every vehicle sold in the country. And yet there's a very generous support basis for the APDP. The APDP, however, requires a level of production in order to secure benefits. So there's a minimum scale at the plants, and then, of course, you earn these rebates. And these rebates are then used to import vehicles. So our production will always align with our market. So we have a major challenge in South Africa because at a certain point, our production reaches a level where all the vehicle assemblers can settle their duty accounts for their models they import into the domestic market. At that point, there is no longer an incentive to export vehicles from South Africa or to make any additional vehicles in the country. And so therefore, there's this dynamic relationship between production and domestic demand. And that is why the master plan is highly compromised, because the domestic market is performing so poorly. Now, I want to bring this to the NEV issue. So the challenge we've had on the new energy vehicle side in South Africa is the government's fixated on trying to support new energy vehicles from a production perspective, but obviously doesn't want to support market consumption, because that is the sensitivity in relation to where the government grabs a whole lot of money from the industry, right? That's where the taxes sit. So the challenge that we have is that we've got an incredibly small battery electric vehicle market in the country, and there's no incentive to buying vehicles. Globally, we're in a fractured environment. We've got developing economies like ours. You cannot afford to incentivize new energy vehicle consumption. And then, of course, we've got the developed economies who have, especially during COVID, pumped huge amounts of money into the transition of their vehicle fleets. But there's some challenges that are emerging. The one is they can't keep doing that, right? We are post-COVID, we are emerging from the crisis, and the opportunity, or rather the benefits of extending those incentives are now no longer so obvious. And the key issue is that when those incentives are withdrawn, the market works the way it's supposed to do, which is it favors us over battery electric vehicles, because the vehicles are still a lot cheaper. Plus, there's a whole range of additional issues that we need to understand. BEV are much more expensive to insure. We are still struggling to deal with end-of-life vehicle consequences for BEV product. It's early in their cycle, but we still don't know what to do with the batteries. There are a whole range of complexities that need to be worked out. This is not going to stop the BEV transition. The BEV transition is still going to come, but it may just push it out by 5 to 8 years. So maybe a model cycle. So I think there's a little bit less enthusiasm because some of the market realities are starting to bite. some of the life cycle cost considerations around the cost of insurance, et cetera, on these vehicles, and the cost of fixing them, et cetera, is becoming noticeable. Those are global issues. We haven't even got there yet. And I think we're going to really struggle on the transition to battery electric in South Africa specifically because of our peculiar market structure, which needs to be corrected. So I agree with everything Bev said on the automotive APDP side, but we actually have a huge problem in South Africa in relation to how our market functions. And I've done a lot of policy work in South Africa, but one cannot get National Treasury to shift on anything. And that's since I started working in the early 2000s. And unless we do that, we've got a problem because our domestic market's got no further growth based on all the work we do.
Justin, so yes, I mean, fundamentally what you're saying, it's a price point issue in the local market, right? So we do need, I suppose, a lot of pressure to be put on, I suppose, National Treasury. I think what you're saying is that, we need some relief at duty level to make the vehicles, I suppose, fundamentally more affordable. So you can stimulate more demand, create more demand, and then you create more production. That's fundamentally what you're saying.
So not on the CB, not on the import duty level, but specifically on the ad valorem tax structure level. So South Africa has this perverse situation where we have a 30% luxury tax, but the luxury tax kicks in and there's a valuation gets used, but it's about around about an 800,000 Rand vehicle before VAT is already receiving a 30% luxury tax. In South Africa, which is perverse. You've already got about a 12% luxury tax on about a 200,000 vehicle, 220,000 vehicle. I mean, those vehicles should have no luxury tax on them. And then our 30% stays at 800. So if somebody purchases a 10 million Rand super luxury car, the tax burden of 30% remains constant. So what we've got is we've got an excessively taxed mid-market, and that mid-market is extremely price elastic. So what we're doing is we're forcing consumption down from the mid-market to the bottom end of the market where vehicles are slightly more affordable. In South Africa, you can see it in the profile of our consumption. South African vehicle consumption is in distress, not only in terms of sales, but the clear buying down from the mid-market to the entry point. And I wish National Treasury would do the maths, because when we did the maths a few years ago, we worked out that this is based on 2018 data, so before the COVID crisis, that the South African government was not tax optimized. When we measured the elasticities and we measured the level of the tax, we calculated that the South African government was losing itself billions of rands of tax because of overtaxing vehicles, especially in those lower bands. And given the fact that they've done nothing since then, I'm pretty confident that the situation's gotten a whole lot worse.
Interesting discussion, Justin. So hopefully National Treasury is listening to this. They can get more taxes if they tax less. I mean, Paul, moving on to you. I mean, obviously you manufacture, you supply to OEMs. How's Mete thinking about this NEV transition? Is it creating more opportunities? Bigger risks for you as a business? How's Mete looking at this transition?
So Dwayne, hopefully a little bit more positively than Justin spells out. But from a commercial perspective, the OEMs here in South Africa also have to have a compelling business case, right? For their parent companies. And what is the compelling business case in South Africa? And a lot is also about, well, when you have localized companies such as ourselves, are we competitive? Are we efficient? Are we better than Thailand or any of these other countries? And really, that's where we focus on. So we have a lot of R&D work that goes on within each of our operations. We're seeing to Justin's point and your earlier point is probably a more focus on plug-in hybrid from a South African perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, as opposed to the full NEV. But if we took our broad range of businesses and how we think about it, so we take our wire harnessing businesses and we look at the number of circuits that would be involved in a plug-in hybrid or electric vehicle, how would we accommodate that? More copper content, where's going to be the supply chain for that? So we look at it on that basis. From a lighting perspective, in our lighting businesses, we look around the visibility around the electric vehicle, the additional visibility that may be required, the aesthetics of that lighting. In our heat exchange products, it's a big change from combustion engine to electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid. So how do we position ourselves? What are our technical partners doing around that? In our plastic products, the electric vehicles are heavier. And so you need to reduce weight to make it more efficient. So what more can be done in the molding and the plastics businesses? And the same in our ride control businesses, in the suspension. How do you have to adjust your suspensions and accommodate your suspensions for a potentially heavier vehicle or a different dynamic around the vehicle? And then lastly, in the battery storage, obviously, what is the new technology of the battery storage that's going to be required? So we continually look at this, Dwayne. We continually use our technical partners globally to help us look at this. And continually make sure our people are going globally and looking at the opportunities. And then over and above this, what are the other opportunities that we're not localizing, and how could we adapt to those? So we have a very commercial approach and try and keep on top of latest technology.
Thanks, Paul. Beth, bringing you in here, we've talked about the local manufacturing industry. In sort of my opening remarks, our big markets for South Africa are Europe, Africa, and USA. I think 3 biggest markets. Maybe there should be others, but that's the current reality. How do you see the developments in Europe? Should we be worried? Okay, are our exports at risk? And are other things like, we see out of the EU Green Deal now, carbon border adjustment has been implemented. Yeah, it's not on motor vehicles yet, but it's on aluminium and steel that goes into cars. So, you just play this forward. Let's play this movie forward. Yeah. At some point in the future, we can expect motor vehicles and other components to be subject to this carbon border adjustment over the next couple of years. How do you think that's going to be impacting the South African export industry? Is it a risk or an opportunity for us?
Yeah, for sure. I think let's maybe first start with the CBAM kind of element of your question. So as you say, not currently on vehicles, but I don't think anyone would be sitting here thinking that Europe isn't going to extend CBAM in the coming years to be placed on a lot more products. And even beyond CBAM, if you read into the Green Deal, they've already suggested that I think by next year they'll be implementing or publishing a way in which supply chain emissions in the automotive supply chain specifically can be monitored and checked. What's the point of monitoring and checking things if you're not going to ultimately look to regulate them? So I think it's logical to really extrapolate and say it's going to impact the sector. There's a couple of ways to look at it from an export perspective, and I think we'd be foolish not to consider both elements and act on both elements. The one part is to say our export basket is exceptionally concentrated, both in terms of product and market. As you say, from a market perspective, over 40% of our exports are going to Europe, add on a bit more to Africa, and that's a bit easier, I suppose, as an export opportunity, less regulations. But certainly Europe and then the US, as you say, we know that they're increasingly stringent on particularly environmental regulations, and that poses a degree of risk. Equally, on the component side of things, catalytic converters are over 40% of our export basket from a component side. And we know within a wider NEV transition conversation, specifically with battery electric vehicles, there's a declining demand for catalytic converters. So effectively, what we're sitting with is a heavily concentrated export basket that has a lot of risks to it, both in terms of markets and components supplied. So what is the attitude I think we need to be taking? On one part, preserve what we do have. It's not going to be an overnight transition from ICE to BEV in the next year. There is still opportunity in the ICE world. And so how do we really capture that opportunity? Can we pull in the last of the Capcom production? It would make sense given that we have PGMs locally available. And so there's strategies to look at how do we preserve the ICE production we have. From a European market perspective, it's certainly starting to get suppliers ready to lower their carbon emissions, remain up to date with what the regulations are requiring of them, so that when the time comes that we remain competitive in a European market. So that's the kind of protective element to try and mitigate the risks. The other side of it, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, is, well, where do the opportunities sit? And I think positively, I was reading Minister Tao's budget vote speech that I think came out a day or two ago, and equally Deputy Minister Whitfield's, and there they've really stressed the importance of exports and growing export markets. And I think working with the government and private sector, there's a lot of scope for us to look into, well, what components could become, I don't want to say the next CatCons, but could become a really big export opportunity for us. Where do we have competitive advantages and how do we promote that? And equally looking and doing a full assessment of existing trade relations, the countries where we maybe need to get better trade relations to really expand the markets we export to. So we're almost tackling it from two directions, which is preserve what we have, but equally grow what we currently don't have, to try and find ourselves not just in a position where we sit maybe in 10 years' time with the same export basket and we've managed to maintain it at, what is it currently, around 70 billion rands worth of component exports per annum. Like, how do we grow that even further? And as I said at the beginning of my chat with you earlier, exports really is a way to de-risk our own domestic industry. And so I think that's the approach we need to take. Do I have the answers now exactly which components and which markets? Absolutely not. But that's certainly the work both NARCAM and I'm sure DTIC and other stakeholders will be doing over the next couple of months and years.
Thanks, Beth. Obviously, there is a really good opportunity to obviously de-risk our exports. It is quite concentrated, as you say. As I think, I said in my opening remarks, Africa is our second biggest market. But the question is, could it be much bigger? We know the AAAM is putting a lot of effort into Africa and creating an Africa auto strategy, hub and spoke model, and looking at and also doing research around what are the real opportunities for OEMs, but also for component manufacturers across Africa. So maybe Justin, maybe bringing you back into the discussion around, what do you see the opportunities for South African manufacturers in Africa? Is there a real opportunity for us to grow what we're currently doing?
Yeah.
And maybe some of your insights and comments on in what sectors and which part is there a big opportunity in the ICE value chain? Because even though there might be bans in Europe, I haven't really seen too many notifications from African governments around banning ICE vehicles in Africa. So maybe some of your comments there.
So Dwayne, I think once again, building off Beth's views, I completely agree. I think we're quite vulnerable because of our exposure to Europe. When I did the maths a couple of years ago, 82% of the value generated in the South African auto assembly industry is generated from exports, because we export much more valuable vehicles than what we supply locally. So we're vulnerable. And 70% of those exports go into the broader European market area. So if we include the EU, the European Free Trade Area, as well as the United Kingdom, all of which are shifting. They've either got very tight, they've already got tight controls. They've all announced, I think, prematurely bans on the internal combustion engine. And of course, the CBAM by 2030 is supposed to include all imports into the EU. So although it's steel and aluminium now, vehicles will be included very shortly. So we know there are going to be consequences and we have vulnerabilities. So the natural market for us is Africa. But here's the big challenge. Africa doesn't need South Africa. Africa needs to develop regional value chains. And so the challenge for us as South Africans is, if we want to be major players in and be supportive of the development of a true African automotive industry, we have to operate in Africa very differently from the established importers into those markets. So Africa is a huge market, potentially. The problem is the importation of pre-owned vehicles. There's a large amount of dumping of product in African markets. So at the moment, I'm actually the advisor to the Côte d'Ivoire government on their automotive policy and the advisor to the Benin government on their policy. So I've been doing a lot of work in West Africa over the last couple of years. And all I see is opportunity. But I often think as South Africans, we ask the wrong question, because they don't need our product. They need to develop their own industrial capabilities. So the question is, and this is why I really support the work of the AAAM, is how do we create regional value chains? How do we realize the potential of this 5 million vehicle market? Because it doesn't have to be created, it's there. We need to displace the importing of the secondhand and grey goods, because there's a huge amount of dumping of new vehicles, but that are not officially exported through the OEMs, and principally done through the Middle East. And if we could shift that, then we have the potential. So take a country like Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire, until 2017, permitted old vehicles on its roads and sold hardly any new vehicles. They introduced a 5-year limit on passenger vehicles. That passenger vehicle market is now 28,000 units. It's the largest in West Africa by some margin. They've got about another 12,000 units that are being displaced by pre-owned vehicle imports that are coming in, so the ones that are less than 5 years. So they're up to a market of around 40,000 units. If we start repeating that across many economies, then we're in a position to see this major growth potential. In the case of Côte d'Ivoire, they will ban the importing of second-hand motor cars by 2035 completely. And then they'll probably have a market of around 55, 60,000 units. Still small, but when you start looking at Ghana and Senegal, and if Nigeria ever puts together a reasonable policy, it will obviously then grow very, very rapidly as well. So there's a huge market potential. The challenge is, and this is the tension that we have in South Africa, is we want to sell product into these African economies. And I just don't see it. We need to build industrial capability with these economies. We have to find reciprocal trade opportunities with these economies so that we can jointly develop this massive potential that exists in Africa. Otherwise, the African countries are going to find other partners to work with, and we'll miss the boat.
And Justin, in some interesting numbers you quoted there, right? Sort of 5 million, I suppose, car market. Obviously, a lot of those are currently second-hand vehicles coming from, I suppose, mostly the East, I would guess. It is, I suppose, reassuring that the governments are starting to understand to create a market, you must stop allowing the imports of the vehicle. So you're saying that the potential automotive market in Africa can be 5 times bigger, okay, from like a million vehicles produced to 5 million. That sounds like a really big opportunity. And I get your point. It can't just be South Africa just exporting. So I think the challenge what I'm sounding you putting down to the auto value chain is that how do they go and partner with those other African countries to create a value chain, a regional value chain that there's benefits to both, as opposed to you just seeing them as another market. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key issue is these economies need to structurally transform. So, in our position, we've got a very sizable base. So I'll give you an example. South Africa has 10 million adults that can afford a motor car. We've had 10 million adults who could afford a motor car for a decade, and all of the projections going forward, for as long as the modeling that we've done can be projected forward, is we'll still have 10 million adults who can afford a motor car. South Africa does not have a growing middle class. We have a completely static middle class. We've reached peak vehicle consumption based on the data that I have. A country like Côte d'Ivoire, for example, only has 1 million adults that can afford a motor car. But by 2035, they will have 3 million adults. And when they can afford a car. And these other small economies like Benin that are starting with a much smaller base, but they're all going through the same transformation. And it's the accumulation of that purchasing power that ultimately gives the African automotive market space a real gravity. The question for us is, how do we position South Africa to play a leading role as that gravity develops? Because there's a belief in South Africa that we're sort of the entry point into Africa, and I just don't buy it. We're on the one extremity, and there are many other opportunities. We have to be very conscious, and we have to be very strategic in how we collaborate with, in order to create these opportunities.
Yeah, and Justin, I think the AAAM, I think, is doing a lot of good work to create what's the right word, bridges,
Yeah.
and opportunities for collaboration, also doing a lot of research to work out what are those opportunities in these countries for localization. I think it fundamentally comes about to create a proper auto industry. You need policy, okay, like we talked about earlier. So you need strong automotive policy to create the foundation, and then you obviously need to create a market. So I mean, coming to you, Paul. I mean, you've got a strong automotive value chain. You manufacture various different products, in the Metair group. You say wiring harnesses. I think is really is a good example. I mean, what do you think the opportunities? I mean, based on what Justin is saying, I mean, what do you think the opportunities in the Metair group will be apart from, I suppose, what you've already spoken to us about?
Yeah, no, so you know, I 100% agree with what Justin has said. But it's a pity because you know this discussion needs the OEMs involved as well, because we're just the component supplier. And if you look at the history of the South African market and where it sits today, and maybe the Moroccan in the north, you know, the two major producers on the African continent of motor vehicles, it's how does South Africa, 100% to what Justin said, work together with other African countries to encourage OEMs in setting up manufacturing facilities in those countries? How can Africa become really competitive in having other manufacturing hotspots? And once you have that, you can then create what we are, which is a tier one, which is a auto component manufacturer for those OEMs. You know, the aftermarket, the other point that Justin has said, that's a different ballgame. You know, that's challenges against all sorts of grey goods and other goods, and you know that is the rest of Africa is just about aftermarket parts flooded in from anywhere else. So the structural approach that Justin has said is got to be the vision of where Africa as a continent becomes the OEM choice destination, no matter which part it is in. There's got to be a lot of sharing, and we can help as South Africans share that technology, encourage the technical partners that we have, and build those other industries, or build the OEM industry in those other African countries. That's got to be the next step. Otherwise, we're just sitting here. To Justin's point, I gave you the figures of the vehicles. Where's it all going? Is it going to grow? Is it just going to be stagnant? Will we ever hit the 1.3 million vehicles in South Africa as per the auto industry plan? And so, you know, all of the auto component manufacturers that are here, not just Metair, are very good at what they do because they help keep the OEMs competitive. And so they're all very good. But it's not enough to sit at 600,000 vehicles for the next 10 years because, you know, that's a very sorry picture from a South African perspective.
Hmm. So I mean, Paul, I mean, when you make an important point, is I mean, the OEMs are a big part of the solution to this conversation. And I mean, we're talking about the market opportunity for cars in Africa, right? I mean, obviously, second-hand cars nearly destroys that market, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so as we're going on a journey to, I suppose, put up a trade barrier to make sure there's no imports of second-hand cars. I mean, we've seen that in South Africa, how effective that is, right? I mean, if you allowed second-hand cars to be imported in South Africa with our challenges around duties and price points, I mean, it would have a significant impact on OEMs. I mean, I suppose the question is always about how can us as a collective, I mean, component manufacturers, OEMs, work closer together to create those regional value chains that Justin's talking about. We've got the AAAM. I mean, is there more that needs to be done?
No, I think the AAAM is a very good starting point, Dwayne, but you also then need government alignment across Africa, like in many other industries. So that alignment from a free trade, from a collective, I always, and I'm new to the industry, but I really love these South African industries that can walk with pride, and really help the African continent expand. But you have to sit back and say, why can't Africa and many of these other countries be what Thailand does for the OEMs? Why does it have to be Thailand? And that's the mentality we have to adopt. Otherwise, we will just sit here and just struggle along. So AAAM is very good. It's a great initiative. NARCAM, NAMSA, but you have to have governmental alignment across Africa through trade agreements, etc.
And Paul, you also see over it's a global organization. It's not just a South African organization. I mean, are there any lessons? I mean, I think you say you're sitting in Turkey currently. I mean, are there any lessons? I mean, from those operations that we can bring back to South Africa to, accelerate some of this transition?
It's very competitive, Dwayne. The advantage. So we have battery plants, as you know, in Turkey and Romania, who have relationships with OEMs and have relationships with the aftermarkets. So I wouldn't say there's a learning. I think the key for us as auto component manufacturers, and that's just the way the industry has been created, is those technical partners that we use are key. And getting those technical partners who have the IP and have the knowledge as part of the solution in helping build the African story, I think that could be an avenue perhaps that we have not explored properly.
Yeah. I mean, you make an interesting point. I mean, with all the, I suppose, NEV vehicles and all the technology going into vehicles these days, right? I mean, there's new brands popping up all the time in the auto value chain, and a lot of those are in the technology space. We all talk about e-mobility these days. Lots of different business plans, business cases, but there's lots of different, maybe more technical partners. I think your point is that maybe we need to be crowding into the South African and African into the landscape. Also, I mean, I've been working with lots of automotive companies and also lots of technology companies, and South Africa has got some real strength in technology. I mean, you just go down to the Cape and Stellenbosch and see all those technology hubs there, and even some of them in the auto sector. And yeah, maybe there's something there that we maybe need to. There's a gem that maybe we need to incubate even further to create more opportunities across the auto value chain, because I think technology is a big part of the solution.
Agree. And again, it can't be Metair alone. It's got to involve OEMs. It's got to involve the rest of the auto component manufacturers. It's got to be a joint effort. Yes, we're all about commercial return, but if you want to grow, you have to have a growth mindset that says you do it as a collective.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So Beth, I mean, just thinking about this NEV ICE, it's a balance, right? Okay. And I was looking at some of the numbers that were coming out of Egypt around setting targets around NEV versus ICE balance. And I think they were setting targets to, I think, about 17% best case to be EVs by 2050. That's a long way away. But I'll look at it another way. So that's 17% EVs, that's 83%. That's ICE, still going to be ICE vehicles in many African markets, and I assume many other markets around the world as well, right? How should the industry be thinking about that balance? And also as well, even if you're not making ICE vehicles anymore, I mean, there might still be lots on the road that need parts, right? So you've got lots of members who are going to still have to carry on making parts for those vehicles for many, many years to come. So maybe just some of your insights on that balance.
Ren, I think you hit the nail on the head when you use the word balance there. I think from a strategy perspective, it would be silly for us to put all the eggs in the EV basket right now and forget about the opportunities that align with ICE. But likewise, I think we'd be silly to just think, ICE is the future forevermore and not be looking at what the opportunities under an EV ecosystem would be. I think from a South African perspective, you highlighted already the kind of guys who'd be supplying aftermarket parts for the ICE vehicles that'll still be on the road long past, the initial phase out of the sale of new ICE vehicles. So they certainly have a place, and they still need to be operating. And so it's how do we keep them competitive in a South African environment? Equally, I think, and we often as NARCAM get the question of, can the component supplier base respond to an EV transition? What is the kind of positioning of our component sector? And I think the first thing to also recognize here is a lot of what we do, minus the export basket, which is a bit more technology specific, a lot of what we are producing here is technology neutral. I always use the kind of layman example of a seat is a seat is a seat. Yes, there's odd changes within an EV, weight changes, etc., but a seat will still have application in an electric vehicle. And so a lot of what we are producing will work in an ICE vehicle, will work in an electric vehicle, and that at least mitigates some risk of overnight or even over a period of time, everything that we're producing in South Africa will become obsolete, shall we call it. I also think if we look more on the kind of South African trajectory of what we're producing here, I don't think we're going to find a case where suddenly our domestic OEMs are going from ICE to solely producing even hybrids or battery electric vehicles. What you're seeing most of them doing is having a facility that has an ICE variant, a hybrid variant, and maybe in the future a battery variant. And so that equally provides a bit more of a, I guess, scope for any of our component suppliers that are producing technology-specific components, such as your catalytic converters. And then looking more specifically at a point in time where investments are needed for more battery electric vehicles. Paul's clearly highlighted it. Companies aren't just sitting around and waiting for it to happen. They're actively researching, they're actively identifying where opportunities sit. And a lot of our sector is in a good position in the sense of, a lot of them are multinationals. I think probably about 60 to 70% of our tier ones in the country are multinationals. So even if they in the South African subsidiary don't have the technology, their sister companies somewhere in the world generally do. And so the question becomes, how do we make South Africa as competitive and as attractive as possible to onshore those type of technologies? And then even where, companies don't necessarily or aren't part of a multinational group, someone like a Meta that, yes, okay, they do have some companies abroad, but equally, Paul highlighted, they have technology partnerships, and that's not unique just to a Meta. There's plenty of other local companies that similarly do have those type of international partnerships. So I think in trying to kind of weigh up that ICE versus EV debate, I don't think it's a cop-out. I think we have to somewhat sit in the middle and say, how do we position ourselves to still support ICE and not forget that still is an opportunity that still has a lot of fruit to bear for a lot of our component manufacturers, but also how do we position ourselves in an EV space? And I think, look, the EV, I think Justin mentioned it, we're possibly looking at a longer time frame for that transition, but nevertheless, it's happening. I think if we look at policy amendments that have happened over the last little while, and in fact, at the moment, I know APDP is currently in its amendment phase to incorporate EVs. There is some support there. There's increased AIS to support technology investments into electric vehicle components. So it's kind of an open playing field at the moment in the sense of we need to explore all avenues. We can't close ourselves off to any which technology grouping. But I think the underlying message, so to speak, or important element underneath all of these opportunities is what is putting South Africa in a competitive position? How do we bolster overall sector competitiveness? If we do that, we can respond to any opportunity that comes our way, as long as we're competitive. And that needs to be addressed in certain elements to ensure that we can remain part of a global value chain.
Thanks, Beth. I see moving on to some of the questions. I see Mike's posed a question here around, obviously we've got ICE vehicles and we've got EV vehicles, okay? But there obviously is there's some concessions, or maybe concessions, around allowing what they call e-fuel vehicles after 2035. So I suppose no combustion vehicles, zero combustion vehicles, but still using an ICE engine, right? I think that also creates opportunities. So maybe, Justin, what's your perspective on how that creates opportunities for South Africa to extend maybe the life of, I suppose, the ICE value chain in South Africa? Your comments on that?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this in relation to the African question, because Beth's outlined the challenges for us. So the thing that strikes me from working in different places around Africa is the distinction between their big, concentrated, wealthy cities and the much poorer hinterland. So in these emerging sort of urban agglomerations, places like Cotonou, Abidjan, Dakar, Lagos, Lomé, these places are going to encourage small cars. So one can almost imagine an NEV transition in those spaces. Same in South Africa, the Sandtons, the Cape Town CBD, etc. But the moment you start leaving those centers, you start going into very, very basic infrastructure, where essentially you need a ladder chassis-based product. A monocoque won't cut it, not even a more expensive monocoque. So you're into ladder chassis, and of course, ladder chassis now has a weight-wind coefficient element that makes it far less attractive as a BEV product. So I do think it's not an either or. I think there's going to be, in an African environment, there's going to be a lot more complexity around this transition. Added to that is the critical importance and the need to develop commercial vehicle fleets. So it's the movement of goods as populations become wealthier and there's more consumption. But there's also the movement of people in terms of either minibuses, bigger buses, etc., commuter buses. So there's going to be a reconfiguration, because the key is to get people with motorcycles and into much safer transport modes. So I think we're going to see this. We're going to see this blend, and it's in that blend that I don't think the technological answers are there yet. So you can get a hydrogen ICE, and I think hydrogen ICE, there's strong proponents for hydrogen ICE. There's synthetic, not synthetic, there's biofuels as options for us that would render them a lot more environmentally sort of sustainable. So I think there's going to be a range of differential greener technologies that would apply. It's all a bit ironic when I go to some of these big ports in different African contexts, and the trucks on average, and I'm not exaggerating, I'd put a whole lot of money down that the average age of the trucks is 40 years. If one was to just modernize that fleet to an average of 10 years, you'd get rid of over half of the carbon that's being emitted by those incredibly old, inefficient trucks. So there is a lot of stuff that gets spoken about without really understanding context in relation to these countries. And I think the modernization of their ICE fleets would be of huge positive consequence for the greening of the transport sector in Africa. So I think ICE has got a big component still.
Cool. Thanks for that. Maybe Beth, maybe changing a little bit of tack here. I mean, obviously as a component manufacturing association, I mean, there must be lots of pressure to create more localization opportunities and crowding the smaller business sector. Okay, so the question here is, I mean, how can smaller businesses be part of this auto value chain? Are there specific opportunities that need to be looked at? Are there specific opportunities that need to be manufacturing other products and can tilt to auto? Maybe just some of your insights around, is there an opportunity to crowd in other smaller manufacturers into the auto value chain?
Sure. So I think maybe just starting at the first point, which is, I mean, just crowding anyone into the automotive sector, I think Paul would certainly agree on this one, is that we need to be increasing volumes to create scale economies and to make the business case more viable to be in the value chain. From a smaller kind of enterprise perspective, and that's something that as Narcam we spend a lot of our time looking at, and particularly a kind of transformed tier 2, tier 3 base. And I say specifically tier 2, tier 3, I think that's really where, at an early stage of someone coming into the sector, that's probably the easiest entry point, purely from the basis of, or the quality requirements are slightly less than if you're supplying as a tier 1 directly into your OEMs. So you can get away with say an ISO 9001 at a tier 2, tier 3 level. When you're supplying into OEMs, very often you're needing IATF 16949 and more kind of technical specifications there. And equally, a lot of the tier 1 value chain is dominated by global purchase arrangements with multinationals. So I think from a SME perspective, coming in at that tier 2, tier 3 base is the easiest, and there's never anything easy in getting into the autos value chain, but that's certainly easier than a tier 1 sort of area. That being said, you made a mention of, should they be doing something else and then coming in? I think our lessons in NARCAM at least is that very often getting people in from what we term the allied sectors. So if you're thinking aviation, maritime, rail, etc., crowding those guys who already have an existing business in those sectors where often lower volume, less demand certainty, but better margins, having them come into the autos value chain makes a bit more sense than having pure startups. I mean, startups certainly can work and there's some cases, but I think having an existing business that equally has the support of other sectors, has additional capacity on that end, can then come into automotive and probably find that transition slightly easier. They've got the existing business to support that kind of entry process into the automotive value chain. So yeah, I think that's really where we see the opportunity is, particularly allied sector companies entering tier 2, tier 3 level. And certainly I think there's a lot more though to be done to make that kind of entry easier. If you ask me where I also see opportunity, I think the automotive investment transformation fund, AITF, is an interesting kind of dynamic to this conversation, because for the first time you're really mandating, particularly OEMs, but component manufacturers are also joining now, mandating them to be incorporating additional, often smaller scale, Black-owned industrialists into the value chain. And along with the kind of financing solution that AITF offers, there's also a guaranteed market access that comes with it. So I think hopefully over the next few years, we'll see a lot more entrants entering at that kind of level. And AITF is certainly something to watch in terms of almost forcing that outcome.
Thanks, Beth. I mean, Paul, have you got anything to add from a Metair perspective in creating and getting smaller companies into the value chain, and leveraging off the AITF?
It's exactly what Beth says. The starting point is the volumes, right? Using the AITF in trying to identify new component parts. Traditionally, we've got significant investments in very large manufacturing facilities, and that's not everybody can do that, right? So how do you get perhaps tier 2, tier 3, maybe more down the technology slant that Beth talks about? So we're fully aware of it, Dwayne. This is a really good South African story, and South African story that needs to be more inclusive of all the opportunities to make us all efficient, and add value, to South Africa. So there are opportunities for sure.
Yeah, and maybe sort of leading into one of the other questions I see around there's a lot of drive in some of the developed markets around recycling. Okay, is that something that Metair is looking at around? Okay, so how do you get using more recycled material in the products you manufacture, and is that maybe an opportunity for these SMEs?
So there's two areas where we actually do recycle. The one would be in our battery manufacture. So recycling old lead acid batteries from both the lead that you recover, but also from the plastic, and using that recycling because it's far easier to recycle a battery and remanufacture rather than buy virgin lead. So that's definitely an opportunity. And then obviously in our molding businesses as well, right? Using as much recycled material as possible, provided you can conform to the spec. But beyond that, I mean, the whole circular economy and where it's going, that's something we are looking at. How do we view the circular economy? How can we get better at the circular economy? So that's definitely something for the future.
Maybe Justin, any of your comments on what you're seeing with the work you're doing in Africa around the circular economy and recycling?
No, I mean, it's obviously an emerging issue. I think one of the big challenges with regards to the automotive industry is how do you capture the value through the life cycle phase and then the disposal phase of the vehicle. Ironically, in an African context, it almost works against us. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the vehicles that are sold in Africa are pre-owned vehicles. I think the average age of a European vehicle dumped in Africa is, I think, 12 years, if I'm correct, old. That's on average. I mean, I've been to parking lots in Benin, supplying into the Nigerian market, that sell up to 400,000 vehicles a year. And it's just literally kilometers of Toyota Highlanders and these sort of mid-size SUVs from the United States, selling between sort of around $15,000 mark into these markets. And it's so patently the rich world dumping its product for short life cycle use and ultimately scrapping. So matter of fact, I was even told that they import vehicles, cut out the cats, sell the cats, and scrap the vehicle. It never ever goes onto the road in a West African market. They literally import the vehicle to cut out the catalytic converter. So there's lots of opportunities, but we've got to sort out this sort of ritual dumping of its product in developing markets, and it's a huge problem in both East and West Africa.
Oh, interesting comments. And I mean, recycling, I think with a lot of the EU Green Deal, I suppose regulations coming into force now, I think it's going to be a big issue if you want to be accessing those markets. So maybe an interesting question here. I see in the steel industry, it's been a challenged industry in South Africa. So maybe a question to you, Beth, here around, how dependent is the sector on locally produced steel? I suppose the reverse of that is how much steel are we importing? And will a disruption in the steel, I suppose, supply impact, I suppose, component manufacturers and or OEMs from making auto cars and components in South Africa? I mean, is that something that NARCAM has looked at?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think, and I'm just going to turn off my camera. I'm seeing a message saying my bandwidth is low. Apologies for that. So I think from a NARCAM end, absolutely, we've looked into this, and a lot of the work we were doing at the start of the year was looking specifically at this. In terms of sector exposure, it's quite interesting. If you look at the split of OEMs, there's probably about 3 of the 7 local OEMs, possibly 4, that are exceptionally exposed to some of the challenges in the local steel market. The other OEMs are almost all mandating that their steel is imported purely because local steel does not meet their own requirements or quality requirements, standard requirements, etc. So you're looking at probably half of the OEMs being exceptionally vulnerable to this, and obviously that then has supply chain implications. From a NARCAM research perspective, I think we looked at about probably 7 companies at immediate significant risk were if AMSA were to close. And I think that's kind of the way we were positioning it as NARCAM, is as much as the impact is very kind of OEM specific, value chain linked, shall we call it, the overall impact on sector competitiveness and the motivation for why we're producing in South Africa, when you don't have local availability of any steel, questions begin to get asked, and the kind of multiplier effect, can we call it, is certainly large, and there'll be questions on the general sector competitiveness. So yeah, long story short, absolutely, some value chains exceptionally exposed and exceptionally reliant on those steel or local steel availability. And in fact, even beyond our local OEMs, I know some of our component manufacturers are not just competitive in a domestic environment, they're exporting their components all over the world. I know US is a big market, and their competitiveness rests purely on being able to access high quality local steel. I think if you're asking me sort of longer term, what needs to happen there, I think AMSA's come out and given some degree of indication that there'll be longer term production, which certainly welcomed. But we need to look at how do we get more local grades of steel approved and available. And I think that would solve some of the AMSA problems in terms of creating demand, but equally would certainly support wider sector localization. And so that's kind of, I think the initial NARCAM step was how do we avoid the initial crisis? The next step is how do we now try and strengthen the steel industry and strengthen the component industry linked to it to create further competitiveness.
Thanks, Beth. I mean, Paul, is the steel industry something that worries you in the value chain and local steel versus imported steel?
It does worry us because we do have one of our operations that's very dependent on the steel. But, it's no different to the gas challenge that's coming. It's no different to the Transnet challenges we work with every day. Eskom at least is recovered. So, these are the things we deal with. So lots to worry about. The issue is, you know, to make sure we can find alternatives, to make sure we can work together. And obviously NARCAM is really, really useful in helping coordinate efforts in this regard. But these are the challenges of, you know, working in South Africa.
So I see we're coming to the close of time. So maybe just with some quick closing comments from Justin, Paul, and Beth. So Justin, your maybe closing remarks.
Dwayne, just looking at some of the questions that were posed around the, for example, Chinese brands in South Africa and sort of pressures in the market. I don't have an issue with regards to competition in the market. What does worry me is that there is a clear clamping down on deemed unfair competition in developed markets, where the subsidies that the Chinese are giving their vehicle assemblers are seen to create an unlevel playing field. And what worries me is that markets like South Africa are going to be the perfect place to dump product. So I really hope that our authorities are closely monitoring the value of these landed vehicles and ensuring that our market is not being further damaged by an unfair playing field in our domestic market. I do policy work in the clothing industry, and I mean, the stuff that comes into this country, stuff that should cost 100 Rand gets declared at 5 Rand. And I'm not giving an exception. The average for the whole year will be 5 Rand when it should be 100 Rand. So the ad valorem duty means nothing. And it really worries me when I see this massive surge of imports coming into our domestic market, whether our customs officials are sleeping at the wheel or whether they are actually ensuring that there's a fair valuation of this product coming into our market. Otherwise, our CBU duty protection means nothing. That's my big concern at the moment.
Thanks, Justin. Paul, your closing comments?
Yeah, Dwayne, you know, this is a classic of, you know, public-private working together here to get it done, solving the issues together. You know, we put a lot of effort when I was previously in the steel industry. There's a lot of effort around, we've got to save manufacturing. Manufacturing creates jobs. This is one of those industries significant to our GDP. And it requires a collective effort as opposed to an individual effort here. But, you know, confidence, great industry to be in, and, you know, great track record and something South Africa can be proud of.
Well, Beth, your closing remarks?
Thanks, Ren. I'm going to follow on from what Paul's saying and try to give a bit more of a positive spin. I worry sometimes that we get too depressed and caught up in the negatives. I think we certainly aren't aware of the challenges. And I think that's a good base to come from. We know what we need to work on. We know what we need to improve. That being said, there are certainly green shoots look, I'm biased and coming from the component sector, but the component sector over the last 5 years, despite so many challenges, has performed relatively well. We've had record exports. We continue to see high levels of capital investment into the sector. We now have multiple OEMs announcing new models coming in the next couple of years. And so I don't want to be overly optimistic and say everything is great, but I certainly do think there is some positivity and green shoots are certainly showing. And I think, as Paul said, it's about cooperation. It's about all the kind of key stakeholders working together, taking what we've now spent a lot of time today discussing in terms of the challenges and how do we build from those challenges and make the opportunities that will more so realize those opportunities. So not being foolishly optimistic, but I do think there are green shoots and it's for us to really capitalize on those.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, so thanks everybody for your time. Our speakers today are sharing your insights. Yeah, hopefully all the attendees got value. Yeah, so now I'd like to hand over back to Shannon to close the session. Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Dwayne. Justin, did you have a last comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I'd like to make one comment. It's a comment that I was recently in a forum with some senior government people, and I said South Africa is a bit of an irony, because if you were to ask me to build something from scratch in Africa, where would the best place be to make it? And without a doubt, it's still South Africa. So we've got the most solid industrial foundation of any African country by a large margin. However, if you were to ask me to gauge the potential for change, given the experiences of the last 10 to 15 years, this would be the last place I'd want to invest in, because the trajectory that we're following is a really negative one. And although we talk positively about these green shoots, I don't see many of them in relation to working with government, to be blunt. I see continued deterioration in public sector capability, which seriously worries me. But that doesn't mean we don't have a solid foundation to work on. So I think we really are in this in a between position. We're in an incredibly strong position comparatively, but we have had such a long period of atrophying that I do think we struggle with that positive mindset and dealing with the structural things that we have to deal with if we're going to regain positive momentum. And that seems to be the eternal struggle.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Justin. And yeah, we hope that the right people are watching this then. But yeah, that brings us to the end of our webinar. And I'd like to say thank you to our facilitator, Dwayne Newman, for enabling an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you also to our panelists, Justin Barnes from TWIMS, Paul O'Flaherty from Metair Investments Limited, and Beth Dealtree from Narcan. Thank you so much to our sponsors, Metair Investments, SEW Eurodrive, and Element Titan for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on the automotive industry. Thank you also to everyone who participated in our live Q&A. Our next webinar takes place on the 31st of July at 2 p.m. and will focus on local manufacturing. The link to register for that event has been shared in the chat. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you for your time and goodbye.